Hello, everyone. My name's James Curran. I'm the CEO of Grok Academy Limited and one of the authors of the previous version of the Australian Curriculum Digital Technologies. That version is version 8. Today, we're here to talk about the draft curriculum version 9 of both digital technologies and also what was previously known as the ICT capability, but is now called digital literacy. Before we get into the curriculum goodies, I want to talk a little bit about Grok Academy. We're an Australian not-for-profit and charity that's been formed from two existing organisations that worked very closely together. One was the Australian Computing Academy at the University of Sydney that's brought you things like the DT Challenges project and the school's cybersecurity challenges, and Grok Learning Proprietary Limited, the for-profit company that supplied both the platform and things like the NCSS challenge activity for thousands of students and teachers around Australia. We've joined forces together into a single entity that aims to educate all learners in transformative computing knowledge, skills, and dispositions, empowering them to meet the challenges and seize the opportunities of the future. And of course, a key part of that here in Australia is continuing to support Australian teachers and students with the digital technologies curriculum and the digital literacy capability. For the next 18 minutes, I'm going to be talking to you about the key changes between version 8 and the draft version 9 of the digital technologies subject within the technologies learning area and this new digital literacy general capability that has not only been renamed, but rethought quite considerably as well. One of the key things I'm going to focus on is the new concept on security and privacy. And we'll talk more about key concepts. And if you've been to any of our workshops in the past, you'll know that this is something that we're really passionate about. And finally, I'm going to give you a quick sneak peek at an activity or activities that Grok Academy provides that supports this version of the curriculum. Now, I want to just remind you that we're talking about a draft curriculum. Things may change. You might have had a chance to look at this as part of the public consultation period, but if you didn't, and I understand fully if you didn't, because we're all teaching in wild times right now, then this session will give you a chance to understand some of the high-level changes within that curriculum. In the next session, I'll be presenting a panel with my colleagues, and I'll talk more about that later, where we go through some of the advantages and disadvantages of the new draft as well. So here are some of the key changes to the digital technologies curriculum itself. First of all, there's a lot of content that has been simplified and clarified in a range of ways. The first thing is that there are now separate content descriptions for foundation. So if you're a kindy teacher that's been wondering, what part of what I should teach in the foundation to year 2 band, you've now actually been given your own set of content descriptions, a much cut down version, which gives you a clearer sense of what to prioritize in that very critical first year of school. Secondly, a number of the content descriptions that were compressed due to a limit on the number of content descriptions, and what I talk about as dodgy ands, have been split into separate content. Thirdly, there's content that was previously taught and described separately in digital technologies and mathematics to do with data collection and its interpretation that has now been turned into shared content between the two learning areas. And we'll talk more about this in a bit because it's potentially quite controversial. There's also been a simplification of terminology used to describe the specification of a problem and its evaluation as well. And finally, there's a rethink on the achievement standards themselves to focus on not so much summarizing just the content descriptions themselves, but a focus more towards the quality of learning. And finally, there are two new bits of content. And we're really going to focus on the first of these, is that we've taken the existing key concepts and introduced an additional one on privacy and security. And secondly, there's some content that has been pulled from later bands into slightly earlier bands. So for example, binary has been introduced in year 5 and 6, and iteration, one of the concepts in algorithms and implementation, has been pulled into year 3 and 4. So let's talk about a couple of these changes in a little bit more detail. So if you've been to any of our previous presentations, you'll know that I talk about the dodgy ands within the digital technologies curriculum, that every single and needs to be considered potentially suspicious. Is it a real and, or is it actually something that has just been put there to satisfy some curriculum requirements. So version 8 had some quite strict limits on the number and the length of the content descriptions. So many of the content descriptions were actually either combined together, so it would be one idea and that's where those dodgy ands are, some other idea, or there would be other merging. Now here I'm going to give you an example of how this has happened. So if you remember, one of the content descriptions in year 7 and 8 is investigate how digital systems represent text, image, and audio data in binary. Now, the problem here is that the original intent of the authors from the last version of the curriculum, and I can say this with confidence because I was one of the ones that was doing this, is that this was actually two separate ideas. The first thing is we wanted our kids to understand how digital systems represent these three really central data types: text, image, and audio data, not in binary, but just in whole numbers. And then a second thing, quite a separate idea, was how those whole numbers are in turn represented in binary. And so while the result is in the version 9 draft is two separate content descriptions now, the first you can see text, image, and audio data using integers, and the second explain how and why digital systems represent integers in binary. They may actually look like more content, but in fact, that's actually a substantial reduction in the amount of work that teachers would need to cover for these two things, and reduces the complexity for which students need to understand binary. So there are lots of places in this draft curriculum that looks like there's more content, but in fact, there is often less. And that's largely because the additional, let's call it curriculum budget, dot points, length of content descriptions, those restrictions have been relaxed, and we can now be more specific and explicit about what's required, and that simplifies things quite a lot. Another place that there has been substantial simplification, as I mentioned before, is sharing the data content descriptions with mathematics, not right across the board. So secondary teachers, don't worry, you've still got your own silos there, but in primary, where every primary teacher is constantly integrating multiple learning areas anyway, we have identified a significant overlap in how data collection and interpretation has been represented between mathematics and digital technologies. And look, there is some specific emphasis on things in each learning area that we've needed to take into account. Clearly, mathematics, for example, has a focus on statistics and on specific visualization, so certain types of graphs, and not only the creation of those graphs, but the interpretation of them, and also looking really quite specifically at numerical and categorical data. Digital technologies, not surprisingly, has had a focus on the digital tools themselves, but also some things to do with data collection, such as validating the data, and also looking at the collection of non-numerical data types that hasn't been something that has been a focus in mathematics. But what's interesting is across both, there really is an emphasis on a problem-solving methodology. What can you do? What questions can you answer by collecting data and then interpreting it? And those core ideas really have meant that there's an opportunity there to integrate that material and digital technologies in maths. Unfortunately, it's actually been quite hard for teachers to do because, for a start, the terminology has often been different when describing the same skills. So, for example, a visualization or skills or ideas. So visualization in digital technologies is described as data display in mathematics. And at the same time, other terms are the same in both learning areas, but they actually represent different things. So data representation in digital technologies is a more abstract concept for representing all kinds of information, whereas in mathematics, it's tended to mean visualizations. And so the fairly tough position we came to in the end was this content should actually be genuinely shared between both learning areas. Now, unfortunately, in the consultation documents, if you've read through them, the content was described as being in mathematics and pointed to in digital technologies, but we're expecting to see that this content is truly shared between both learning areas in terms of how it's represented on the Australian curriculum website. So to be clear, this content is not just owned by mathematics, but it's actually genuinely shared between both learning areas. So let's now talk about the changes to digital literacy. First of all, we've changed the name. The name ICT was something that was already out of date when we were writing the shaping paper in 2010 for digital technologies, and was definitely completely out of date now. And digital literacy is very much the preferred term, meaning that if teachers really need to look for resources to support this, they're going to be able to search for the critical terms. The second thing is that there are new sub-elements and statements on security and privacy. And that's because the world has really changed substantially since the version 8 of the digital technologies curriculum was written. And so both digital literacy and digital technologies have substantially increased the amount of content and skills and knowledge on security and privacy. So in version 8, there were two sub-elements. One within applying social and ethical protocols and practices when using ICT. And now you can see in the new version, it's been explicitly called out with 3 sub-elements under an element practicing digital safety and well-being. So we've really brought that front and center, both in digital literacy and then how that ties into digital technologies. And I suppose the final thing is that there's also an additional element on protecting content, so related to privacy and security under managing and operating. So there really is quite a ramping up of security within and privacy within this new curriculum. And of course, because this is digital literacy as the capability, it's not only going to apply to the digital technologies curriculum. And of course, the digital technologies curriculum is where students will first learn many, but not all of the skills in the digital literacy capability, but then those skills will need to be expanded upon and consolidated and applied within all learning areas, just like all of the general capabilities. And finally, we've removed some of the digital literacy content that really belongs in digital technologies only. For example, there was previously an element or sub-element on the impact of digital technologies, and now that sits only within the subject itself. So I want to just go back and remind you of the version 8 key concepts. So there were 10 key concepts: abstraction, the representation of data, the collection of that data and then its interpretation, the specification of a problem, its solution as an algorithm, and then the implementation of that algorithm in one or more automation system, typically by writing some code. Digital systems are the devices on which this code then runs. Interactions covers 2 things. It covers human-to-human interactions mediated by technology, so that includes communication and collaboration tools. And it also includes human-computer interaction. So how do we build user interfaces and user experiences that give our users the most natural and efficient use of the technology? And finally, impact, the ways that digital technologies has made and remade every aspect of our life and society. So there were the 10 original key concepts, and now we're adding an 11th key concept on privacy and security. And I guess 11 is a number, you know, if you're a sports fan, soccer or cricket, you know, we should know that in Australia there should be 11 of anything. So in digital technologies, version 8, the words safe, safely, secure, securely, security, privacy, and so on was sprinkled quite randomly in lots of different places within the content descriptions, the achievement standards, and the bands descriptions for the digital technologies curriculum. But it had very little concrete direction for teachers in terms of what is it that we're actually meant to do. If kids are doing these things safely, for example, what does that mean? Digital literacy, both version 8 and the new version 9, has multiple sub-elements on privacy and security, but unfortunately, they were not well supported by the digital technologies curriculum itself. And so the new version of digital technologies has this key concept, and it has one thread or one row of content descriptions on privacy, covering things like digital footprints and their permanence, right through to the Australian privacy principles. And then security is the second thread, and that has starts with things like passwords, passphrases, and then heads towards multi-factor authentication, and also looking at broader cybersecurity threats and mitigations. Now, you might say, gosh, we're hardly fitting in everything we've already got in digital technologies. My school is not giving me the number of hours I need to teach this subject properly. Why are you piling in more content here? And the answer is, first of all, we need it. The world has changed. There is a cybersecurity attack on an Australian government agency or Parliament itself or our major companies almost on a weekly basis. And that's something that when we were first drafting the previous version of digital technologies was just simply not the case. So the world has changed and the curriculum needs to change to support that. The other thing is that many schools are already teaching a lot of this content as an extension to existing cyber safety programs. And a lot of the things that we're talking about in these new content descriptions are actually practical skills that students already need to interact with digital technologies across all learning areas. And finally, I guess, what we've found in Grok Academy is that our school cybersecurity challenges that have had over 140,000 students and teachers participate has demonstrated that there's a real demand and hunger in schools from teachers, students, and parents for cybersecurity skills, knowledge, and disposition to be taught to our kids. So let's dive into just a little bit more detail about the thread on security. So it starts out with students in year 1 and 2 using a recorded username and password to access their own information. That's just logging in using information that a teacher will typically provide on a little card or written somewhere inside a notebook, or they'll have a shared password across all of the students in year 1 and 2. By year 3 and 4, we expect students to have their own memorized password, and not only that, but to be able to explain why their password should be easy for them to remember, but hard for others to guess. By year 5 and 6, that's become more sophisticated again. We want students to understand not only to create a simple password, to use unique passphrases and explain why it's very bad news to reuse a password across different websites. By year 7 and 8, we expect students to understand multi-factor authentication. And so that could be using a 2FA token or a device or an app on their phone to provide that second factor of authentication, and also start identifying phishing and malware threats. And finally, the year 9 and 10 version extends that further to look at broader cybersecurity threats and their mitigation, and also other tools like password managers to protect their security. In terms of privacy, we want students, first of all, to understand that some of the data that is personal and is owned by them and should be under their control. That starts in foundation. By year 1 and 2, we're looking at students discussing websites and apps that do store their personal data online. And by 3 and 4, we want them to be much more specific about that. For any particular tool they're using, whether it's Minecraft, Roblox, or even tools that their parents use, identify what personal data is stored and shared in those accounts, and discuss what are the risks associated with having that data stored online. By year 5 and 6, we're starting to look at their digital footprint more broadly and assess in year 7 and 8 if the data is essential to the purpose of websites and systems that are collecting that data. And by year 9 and 10, for those elective students who are taking the elective subject, we want them to really start delving into things like the Australian privacy principles and understand in a deeper way how data it should or shouldn't be stored in various systems that they use and they create. Now, I'm going to very quickly race you through a little bit of an activity that we've developed in Grok Academy. It's still sitting on one of our old websites, the Australian Computing Academy website, aca.edu.au/cyber. And here is quickly what the website shows. So that we've got a range of activities to support cybersecurity skills in conjunction with digital technologies curriculum content for the current version of the curriculum right now, not just the future version. And here's a quick taster of one of those activities. So in this activity, your character, Sam, is a member of your school's White Hat cybersecurity team. And in that team, you get asked to find various bits of information in this fake social media world that we've created. There's a fake phone, a fake Facebook, which I'll show you here. We're going to go into the fake Instagram, and we're going to find various bits of information about our characters here. So Sam, for example, Fabian has provided his street name, and his friend Harry has finished that off with his suburb. And what your character needs to do is extract that various bits of information from this fake social media world, and in the process identify how personal information can be so easily leaked online. It goes from that as a starting point. It's very accessible for years 7 through to 12 students. And there's a year 5 and 6 version that we've just released due to the demand from primary school teachers for access to the same kind of activity. So it starts with this fake social media world, but then students learn about creating more sophisticated passwords. They learn about two-factor authentication and how it can protect them even if their information is leaked online via things like social media and used to guess their passwords. So in summary, are we there yet? Well, no. New South Wales hasn't even introduced version 8 of the digital technologies curriculum for year 9 and 10 students yet. Many schools are still just starting their digital technologies and digital literacy learning journey, and that's okay. And other learning areas definitely haven't consolidated digital literacy as effectively as we need to. So should we be updating this curriculum at all? Absolutely. The world continues to change and the curriculum needs to change with it. And teachers, as you know, you refine your teaching and activities every year, and the curriculum should be updated on a more frequent basis so that we're making smaller iterative changes rather than large disruptive changes. So we look forward to working with every Australian teacher on the implementation of digital technologies and digital literacy version 9 when it starts in the new year. If you've got any more comments or questions about digital technologies or digital literacy, please mail us to help@grokkacademy.org, and shortly stay with us for the panel session where I discuss with Anna Kinane, Bruce Feuder, Jane Batham and Paula Christopherson their thoughts on this new draft version of the curriculum. Thanks everyone, and have a great day.